So I'm off on another tangent today. I've been working to try and bring this series full circle and relate it to the 1,000 years added to time and the little season of Satan, but the rabbit hole just keeps getting bigger. And I'd like to just investigate the Roman Piso story and explain why I believe that this story is a Rothschild invention, and I think there may be some truth in it. As with everything, they put a little bit of sugar to help the medicine go down, as the saying goes, but I think that the genealogy side of it may be some truth, because there is evidence in other historical investigators who believe that the Vespasian Flavian family were related to the Herods. But the invention of Christianity, I think, is their version of subverting the, as I have said, the sovereignty that Christianity gives to the individual person. And this is what they needed to do in the Soviet takeover by the Bolsheviks. And I'll show a little video here that will reveal how this was used in the destruction of people's belief in Jesus.
Atheists often claim that Jesus never existed. If that is true, then we should expect to find at least some support for the Christ myth theory, as it's called, in history. So, is there support for the Christ myth theory in ancient history? Nope. In fact, it took about 1,800 years for anyone to argue in print that Jesus never existed, like Bruno Bauer. There are lots of documents that talk about Jesus from around the first and following centuries, but none ever claim Jesus was a fictitious character. So the Christ myth theory gets no help from actual history. However, the Christ myth theory did have brief popularity in the Soviet Union. One of the first Christ myth writers, Bruno Bauer, was teacher and mentor to Karl Marx, the founder of communism. It was not supported by academic pursuits in the Soviet Union, but by government violence. The Soviet Union, in their anti-religion campaigns, arrested, imprisoned, and executed thousands of ministers and martyred millions of Christians. This was done to support Soviet atheism, of which the Christ myth theory was a tenet. Even decades of violence could not completely stomp out the idea that Jesus existed. In fact, before the popularity of the internet, the Christ myth theory had nearly fizzled out. Now it is mostly promoted by bloggers and self-published authors who don't have a relevant academic degree. That's why Oxford, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, Columbia, Cornell, Cambridge, and all the other universities employ and publish scholars who teach that Jesus existed.
I'm not a big pusher of peer review or must have university degrees to be someone who can comment on anything in history or anything academic. However, I do realize that people who are in these institutions and who have these degrees do have access to manuscripts and research that the average person doesn't have access to. Roman Piso theory is a pseudo-historical theory of the origins of Christianity. It states that a conspiracy of well-educated Romans, the Piso family, wrote the New Testament and particularly the Gospels as a social control mechanism. Its advocates call it the new classical scholarship. Nobody else takes it seriously. The theory originated in Bruno Bauer's Christus und Caesarion, Christ and the Caesars, from 1877, which claimed that the Romans had authored the New Testament and that Josephus Flavius was the inventor of Jesus. The Pisos are also claimed to have invented the Christian calendar rather than it having been proposed around 525 and adopted in the 800s. So I'm just going to leave it there. The Piso theory we all understand is a Roman family who supposedly invented Christianity to control people through the church and to control the Judean people, which was the complete opposite of what happened. And it wasn't until 300 years after the birth of Christ that the Roman Catholic Church really gained control of the so-called Gentile world via Constantine the Great. So if this was an invention, it's taken them a long time to get going. And as I've stated, the Roman Catholic version of Christianity is very different than the Christianity we see in the Gospels. So Bruno Bauer was a German philosopher with a Rothschild surname and theologian. As a student of Hegel, we should know how they loved their Hegelian philosophy. Bauer was a radical rationalist in philosophy, politics, and biblical criticism. Bauer investigated the source of the New Testament and, beginning with Hegel's Helionophile orientation, concluded that early Christianity owed more to ancient Greek philosophy, Stoicism, than to Judaism. Bruno Bauer is also known for his association and sharp break with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and his later association with Max Stirner and Friedrich Nietzsche. Starting in 1840, he began a series of works arguing that Jesus was a 2nd century fusion of Jewish, Greek, and Roman theology. Bauer was the son of a painter in a porcelain factory and his wife, Eisenberg, in Saxe-Gotha, Altenburg. He studied at the Friedrich Wilhelm University in Berlin from spring 1828 to spring 1832. He became associated with the so-called Right Hegelians under Philipp Mahenke, who engaged Bauer years later to edit the 2nd edition of Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of religion in 1818 and 1832. This was to become one of Bauer's best-known works of 3 volumes, critical edition. The Rothschild family is a wealthy Ashkenazi Jewish family originally from Frankfurt that rose to prominence with Mayer Amschel Rothschild, a court factor to the German Landgraves of Hesse-Kassel in the Free City of Frankfurt, Holy Roman Empire, who established his banking business in 1760. Unlike most previous court factors, Rothschild managed to bequeath his wealth and established an international banking family through his 5 sons, who established business in London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. The family was elevated to noble rank in the Holy Roman Empire and the United Kingdom. The family's documented history starts in 16th century Frankfurt. Its name is derived from the family house Rothschild, built by Isaac Alknen Bacharach in Frankfurt in 1567. And this name Bacharach comes up later. They like to claim that the Rothschilds came out of nowhere, but this is untrue because there was a banking family who were quite powerful at the time that the Rothschilds were actually related to, and I'll show that later in the video. During the 19th century, the Rothschild family possessed the largest private fortune in the world, as well as modern world history. The family wealth declined over the 20th century, sure, and divided among many descendants. Today, their interests cover a diverse range of fields, including financial services, real estate, mining, energy, agricultural, winemaking, and non-profits. There's no such thing as a non-profit. Many examples of the family rural architecture exist across Northwest Europe. Okay, so the first member of the family who was known to use the name Rothschild was Isaac Alken Rothschild, or Bacharach as it says up further, born in 1577. The name is derived from the German Zum Rothen Schild, meaning the red shield, in reference to the house where the family lived for many generations. Paul Johnson writes, "The Rothschilds are elusive. There is no book about them that is both revealing and accurate. Libraries of nonsense have been written about them. A woman who planned to write a book entitled Lies About the Rothschild abandoned it, saying it was relatively easy to spot the lies, but it proved impossible to find out the truth." He writes that unlike the court factors of earlier centuries who had financed and managed European noble houses, but often lost their wealth through violence or exploration, the new kind of international bank created by the Rothschilds was impervious to local attacks. Their assets were held in financial instruments circulating through the world as stocks, bonds, and debts. Changes made by the Rothschilds allowed them to insulate their property from local violence. Henceforth, their real wealth was beyond the reach of the mob, almost beyond the reach of greedy monarchs. Johnson argues that their fortune was generated to the greatest extent by Nathan Mayer Rothschild in London. However, more recent research by Niall Ferguson indicates that greater and equal profits also were raised by the other Rothschild dynasties, including James Mayer de Rothschild in Paris, Karl Mayer von Rothschild in Naples, and Amschel Mayer Rothschild in Frankfurt. So, on most information you can find on the Rothschilds, it will tell you that Mayer Amschel Rothschild, the son of a goldsmith, Mayer Amschel Bauer, was born in Frankfurt on the Main in Germany in 1743. He was the son of Moses Amschel Bauer, an itinerant money lender and goldsmith who, tiring of his wanderings in Eastern Europe, decided to settle down in the city where his first son was born. He opened a shop or counting house on Judenstrasse, or Jew Street. Over the door leading into the shop, he placed a large red shield. At a very early age, Mayer Amschel Bauer showed that he possessed immense intellectual ability, and his father spent much of his time teaching him everything he could about the money-lending business and the lesson he had learned from many sources. The older Bauer originally hoped to have his son trained as a rabbi, but the father's ultimate untimely death put an end to such plans. So they like to push this story that they had natural ability in banking and intellectual ability, so that they had no help outside of their own family to gain control in the banking arena, and it was all of their own talent. One of these, Mendel Rothschild, was for several years preacher in Prague, then rabbi of Bamberg, and finally rabbi of Worms for 14 years. Mayer Amschel Rothschild, the first Rothschild of any prominence, was one Amschel Moses Rothschild, a small merchant and money changer at Frankfurt on the Main. But the founder of the house was his son, Mayer Amschel Rothschild, born in that city about 1743. When a boy, Mayer used to be sent to exchange money for his father's banking business, and he thereby developed an interest in coins, which was practical and scientific. He was at one time destined for the rabbinate, which shows they were highly involved in the synagogue, and studied for that purpose in Fürth. He soon changed his career, however, and took a post in the Oppenheimer banking house in Hanover. About 1760, he started in business for himself in his native city, in the house of his father, who was then dead. He married in August 29, 1770, Gertl Schnapper, who lived to see her sons at the head of the European finance. Mayer was a general agent and banker, and traded also in works of art and curios. In the later connection, he became an agent of Wilhelm the Ninth Landgrave of Hesse Castle, who on his father's death in 1785 had inherited the largest private fortune in Europe, derived mainly from the hire of troops to the British government for putting down the revolution in the United States. And just for fun, Jacinta Ardern is 17 degrees from Sonche Rothschild. So, on her father's side, great-great-grandfather's mother, sister, son's wife. So very, very, very distant relation there to the Rothschild family of Jacinta Ardern. And no doubt, I'm sure it ties back in somewhere else. So we have this family DNA project, Frankfurt project here, and it's the Bacharach, Schwab, Wertheimer lineage. So Klaus Schwab, and if you look early on in the lineage of all these people, they're all rabbis. So Isaac or Menahem ben Shimon Bacharach Oppenheimer. And we have this Bacharach Rothschilds Bauer family here. Family tree, the Frankfurt project. Menahem Bacharach in 1414, he studied with Solomon Sotin and Jacob Mollen in Mainz. Rabbi Jacob Mollen was also the teacher of Rabbi Jacob ben Yehuda, the Wheel de Stat, who is a DNA match with the Bacharachs. So I have traced these genealogies before, but I didn't have this website. I actually traced them through hours of trying to find surnames through the mothers and so on, and I traced it back. But I'm not going to do that today because it takes hours and hours of work, and I don't have the time to do that. But, it's pretty obvious here of the genetic link between these families. So the Oppenheim family, this is Solomon Oppenheim Jr., was a Jewish banker and founder of the Sell Oppenheim Private Bank. So they were a court banking family. He was born in Bonn, the scion of an illustrious family of court Jews. He had served as advisors and moneylenders to the Prince Archbishops of Cologne and Rhineland area for several generations. In 1789, at the age of 17, Oppenheim Jr. set up a small commission and exchange house in Bonn, then the residence of Prince Archbishop Maximilian Francis of Austria. 9 years later, after French troops had occupied the left bank of the Rhine, Oppenheim Jr. moved to the city of Cologne. He was one of the first Jews who settled in Cologne since the expulsion of the Jewish community in 1424. Oppenheimer became banker and tax collector by order of the French occupying power. After the establishment of the province of Jülich-Klevesburg in 1815, he took service with the Prussian state. And at that point, the French were ruling the area, and the Bourbon French royal family had links to these families, these banking families, via the Orsini. Then is it any wonder that he was allowed in and given the ability to become tax collector and to burden the people of Cologne. Oppenheimer Jr. and his wife Therese Stein, born Deegan Levy, had 12 children. After Solomon's death, 2 of his sons, Simon and Abraham, took over management of the bank. Another son, Dagobert, co-published the Rheinische Zeitung and was a railway industrialist. Okay, so this is just one of the Oppenheimer family. The whole Oppenheimer family is a German Jewish banking family which founded Europe's biggest private bank, Sal Oppenheim. According to the Manager magazine 2008, the Oppenheim family was among the 30 richest families in Germany, with that assets over 8 billion euros. And not only are they in banking, but they're also in mining, because the Oppenheim family are also in the business of diamond and gold mining. So he was born in Friedberg, Hesse, Germany, son of Edward Oppenheimer, a cigar merchant. Yep, sure. Oppenheimer began his working life at 17. He took part in the 1924 South African general election and was elected to the House of Assembly as the member of Kimberley. He had a seat until 1938. In 1927, Ernst Oppenheimer managed to wrest control of the late Cecil Rhodes' De Beers empire and built and consolidated the company's global monopoly over the world's diamond industry until his retirement. He gained the championship of De Beers in 1929. He was involved in a number of controversies, including price fixing, antitrust behavior, and allegations of not releasing industrial diamonds for the US war effort during World War II. So not only are they in the business of banking and diamonds, they're also in the business of making nuclear bombs. J. Robert Oppenheimer was an American theoretical physicist who was professor of physics at the University of California, Berkeley. Oppenheimer was the wartime head of the Los Alamos Laboratory and is among those who are credited with being the father of the atomic bomb for their role in the Manhattan Project, the World War II undertaking that developed the first nuclear weapons. Oppenheimer was among those who observed the Trinity test in New Mexico. So Mayer Amschel Rothschild, how one man founded the Rothschild banking dynasty. No, he didn't. Today, the Rothschild banking family is arguably one of the most famous or infamous families on earth. Whilst there are several branches of the family, they can all trace their heritage back to one man, Mayer Amschel Rothschild. Although he never lived to see his family become one of the richest families on earth, many of the principals Mayer Amschel Rothschild would go on to help ensure the family remained extremely wealthy even after 2 world wars and nationalization of many of their businesses. So Mayer's first known ancestor was Isaac Alkanen Rothschild, who likely moved to Frankfurt Ghetto shortly after the construction in 1567. Sadly, not much else is known about other than he had wealth of 2,700 guilders in 1558. And where did he get that? He got that from his Oppenheimer banking friends. After settling in Frankfurt, Judengasse, he became the first known ancestor of Mayer Amschel Rothschild to use the name Zum Roten Schild, meaning the red shield in Old German, as houses in the ghetto used pictorial names rather than numbers. Over the 200 years or so, the Zum Roten Schild changed their name to Rothschild and began working in the area of finance, as many other Jewish families did at the time due to various laws put in place by the church. And those laws were that Christians could not charge interest. So, according to the Bible, but Jews were allowed to charge interest to those who were not Jewish, according to the Talmud laws, which allowed them to, they considered Gentiles of an inferior being. And ironically, the church in doing this gave the court banking Jews of Europe an advantage over controlling the economy. And I wonder if that was intentional. It quite possibly was. It is here in 1744 where Mayer Amschel Rothschild would be born as one of the 8 children to Amschel Moses Rothschild, a Jewish money changer and silk trader. And silk trading was mainly from the city of Venice, and this ties into the Silk Road gateway to Europe, which was the city of Venice. And I'll investigate that further in future videos. So it's next to impossible to find any information on Bruno Bauer online in regards to his family. And he has a brother called Edgar Bauer, and he was also a radical revolutionary. So all we can find on Bauer's family was the son of a painter in a porcelain factory and his wife at Eisenberg. And there's just nothing online about the family that I can find, or it's extremely hard to find. Edgar Bauer was a German political philosopher and member of the Young Hegelians. He was the younger brother of Bruno Bauer, according to Lawrence S. Diepelvik. Edgar Bauer was the most anarchist of the Young Hegelians. It is possible to discern in early writings of Edgar Bauer the theoretical justification of political terrorism. German anarchists such as Max Nettlau and Gustav Landor credited Edgar Bauer with founding the anarchist tradition in Germany. In the mid-1840s, Marx and Engels' critique of the Bauer brothers marked the beginning of their collaboration and an important stage in the development of Marxist thought. Edgar Bauer participated in the Revolution of 1848, so subsequently he became a conservative. So, I'll read more on him later. But what's the bet that this individual named Bauer, with the same last name as Rothschild ancestors, is the teacher of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and is the student of Hegel? His starting philosophies regarding the non-existence of Jesus, controversy about the Jews, has associations with Friedrich Nietzsche. I mean, all of these major players in the communist Bolshevik revolution. I mean, it says that he rejected Marx and Engels, but they also say that Hegel was a German and had no Jewish association. But when you look into the genealogy of Hegel's mother, so we have George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, was a German philosopher. He is considered one of the most important figures in German idealism. He's also a favorite of the synagogue crowd. Hegel was born on the 27th of August 1770 in Stuttgart, capital of Duchy of Württemberg in Western Germany. Christened George Wilhelm Friedrich, he was known as Wilhelm to his close family. His father, George Ludwig, was Renkermeister, secretary to the Revenue Office at the court of Karl Eugen, Duke of Württemberg. So he's already in these royal courts. Hegel's mother, Maria Magdalena Louise nee Fromm, she was the daughter of a lawyer at the High Court of Justice at Württemberg Court. So let's look up the name Fromm. Here's a random Fromm. Erich Fromm was a German social psychologist, psychoanalyst, sociologist, humanistic philosopher, and democratic socialist. He was a German Jew who fled Nazi regime and settled in the US. So what's the chance that Hegel's mother was related to the court bankers? Her dad was a lawyer to the court. Hegel had a lot to say about Judaism. Hegel himself, when treating of positive or definite bestimate religion, dealt with Judaism as only one of the temporary phases through which the knowledge of God passed in the course of its evolution into the absolute religion, Christianity. He divides bestimate religion into A, natural religions, and B, the religion of spiritual individuality. In the first group are included, besides the lowest called by him the immediate religious or religions of magic, the Oriental religions, the Chinese religion of measure, the Brahman religion of fantasy, the Buddhistic religion of inwardness. Midway between the group and the second, he places Zoroastrianism, which he denominates the religion of good or of light, and the Syrian religion designated as the religion of pain. In the second group, he enumerates the religion of sublimity, Judaism, and the religion of beauty, the Greek, and the religion of utility or of intellect, the Roman. His influence on Jewish thinkers. The influence of Hegel is discernible in writings of Samson Raphael Hirsch, who turned Hegel's system to good account in defense of orthodoxy. Samuel Hirsch, on the other hand, was induced to write his Religion Philosophie der Juden by the desire to show that his master Hegel had misunderstood Judaism. He showed that the central thought in Hegel's system, that man is God's image and that through him the divine is realized on earth, is fundamental to Judaism. According to Arutz Shiva, IsraelNationalNews.com, the great German ideal philosophers of the 18th century, from Kant through to Fichte and Hegel, were all anti-Semitic. So were the outstanding intellectuals who followed or opposed them, such as Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and the young Karl Marx. How could they be anti-Semitic when Karl Marx was Semitic? Apparently, Nietzsche and Kant were less anti-Semitic than others. The tradition climaxed with Martin Heidegger, who many people would consider the 20th century leading philosopher. His commitment to Nazism ran deep and affected his attitude towards Jews. So, according to this article, the person here is saying the Hegelian dialectic is comprised of three essential factors: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, or more easily understood as problem, reaction, solution. The Jews who control America are masters of implementing this Aryan philosophy to subvert more logical solutions in favor of limiting decisions designed to facilitate their domineering world agenda. But is this philosophy Aryan? Is it German? Is Hegel really a German? And I would like to personally say, no, he was not. I mean, his mother, Mary Magdalena Louisa, was the daughter of a lawyer at High Court of Justice at Wittenberg Court. Her surname is Fromm, as I've just pointed out. Fromm is a Jewish last name. And this is not everybody who's Jewish is in on some big conspiracy, but these are court bankers to the Holy Roman Empire. These are related to court banking, to these money changers, these dragon money changers. And we're talking about some of the biggest changes of our society in the modern era. You know, the philosophies that these people came up with caused revolutions in Russia and the whole philosophy of how we look at our world today as far as evolution, and they were the predecessors to the big change in the 20th century. Our philosophical views of creation, our existence, and this guy has very big opinions on Judaism, and yet he's disguising himself as a German. If his mother was Jewish, why would he not say that the biggest woman in his life was Jewish and had a massive influence on him? But no, they hide that. There's no information on that whatsoever. So that brings us to this book, Charlotte and Lionel, a Rothschild love story. How wonderful. Charlotte was young and beautiful. Lionel, almost 10 years older, was rich and her cousin. Of course he was her cousin. They don't marry outside of the family. Theirs was an arranged betrothal joining two branches of Europe's most powerful banking firm. It seemed an unlikely love match, and even their wedding had to survive catastrophe. Yet their marriage lasted through tragedies and triumphs. Charlotte became one of the grand chatelaines of the Victorian era. Lionel, England's leading financier, preserved through years of bigotry to become the first of his faith to be seated in Parliament. In Charlotte and Lionel, acclaimed biographer Stanley Weintraub, using full access to Rothschild family archives, tells the story of their stunning and surprising love for each other, opening a fascinating window to their memorable age. Together, Charlotte and Lionel de Rothschild challenged and redefined their place in Victorian society. At her celebrated salons, England's leading politicians and policymakers met and shared opinions. Disraeli regularly argued politics with adversaries. Gladstone discussed religion with Charlotte. Tom Thumb with P.T. Barnum entertained artists and writers, and aristocrats mingled. Refusing to swear a Christian oath, Lionel was elected to Parliament half a dozen times before he could take his seat. After a decade-long battle, the House of Commons changed its rules, enabling Lionel and future Jewish or non-Christian members to serve. Lionel and behind-the-scenes Charlotte influenced events worldwide, helping to fund relief to a starving island, aided persecuted Jews in Eastern Europe and Middle East, brokering the purchase of the Suez Canal, and arranging for France's post-war reparations to Germany. Yet, despite the distractions of their power, glamour and wealth, the problem of health for which money could buy no solution, they remained intensely devoted to each other and their family. Although Charlotte lost her daughter and then her beloved husband had to come back herself from severe illness, she remained unbroken. So this is a biography, and this writer has had full access to Rothschild family archives. So on page 190 of Charlotte and Lionel, it speaks of a letter to Leo reported only by the tender, and the violence of the shock sent them up into the air to fall from their shattered carriage on the locomotive, where the heat was terrific, and the danger, after having escaped destruction, that their clothes might take fire. The railway line was largely owned by the French and English Rothschilds. Natty disappeared almost completely, and poor Evie could see nothing but the soles of his feet. When she found herself on the ground, she had not any garment on except her shift and her drawers. The remainder of her wearing apparel had been torn off to extricate her. Pinned under the crushed carriage was Bruno Bauer, who, with two other Rothschild agents, was en route to London. Aided by the bruised Natty, they somehow extricated Bauer, who elected to return on a stretcher to Paris to be nursed by his mother and sisters, and perhaps prayed over by his brother, the Monsignor. Only the carriage guard was killed. So Charlotte von Rothschild, the never-to-be-forgotten Baroness, was the daughter of Karl von Rothschild of the Naples house and his wife, Adelheid Hertz, and Hertz is another Rothschild surname. She married her cousin Lionel de Rothschild in Frankfurt on the 15th of June 1836 and had 5 children. She drew her friends from a wide social circle. Disraeli was devoted to her, and the editor of the Times, John Delane, admired her political and intellectual skills. Disraeli was of the same synagogue, so I'm sure that he did admire her. And they were probably instrumental in the build-up to the First and Second World War. So what's the bet that someone named Bruno Bauer was on a train with 2 Rothschilds, a Rothschild-owned train, 2 Rothschild agents on their way to London? And is it the same Bruno Bauer? It speaks that he has 2 sisters and a brother, of which I find it difficult to find any information online. He has the surname of a Rothschild. Bruno Bauer is known for his association and sharp breakup with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and by his later association with Max Stirner. And Friedrich Nietzsche, as we most know, was a German philosopher, critical critic, and philologist whose work has exerted a profound influence on modern intellectual history. So, starting in 1840, he began a series of works arguing that Jesus was a 2nd century fusion of Jewish, Greek, and Roman theology. Bauer was the son of a painter and porcelain factory and his wife at Eisenberg in Saxe-Gotha-Altenburg. He studied the Friedrich Wilhelm University in Berlin from spring 1828 to spring 1832. He became associated with the so-called Right Hegelians under Philipp Marhenke, who engaged Bauer years later to edit the 2nd edition of Hegel's Lectures on Philosophy and Religion. In 1834, he began to teach in Berlin as a licentiate of theology, and in 1839 was transferred to the University of Bonn. In no time in his writing was Bauer ever an Orthodox Christian. From his earliest days of academic scholarship under Hegel, Bauer maintained a firm criticism of Immanuel Kant and a firm fealty to both Hegel's dialectic and his rationalist theory. So from 1839 to 1841, Bauer was a teacher and mentor and close friend of Karl Marx, but in 1841 they came to a break. Marx, with Friedrich Engels, had formulated a socialist and communistic program that Bruno Bauer firmly rejected. Marx and Engels, in turn, expressed their break with Bauer in 2 books, The Holy Family and The German Ideology. So the Prussian Minister of Education, Altenstein, sent Bauer to the University of Bonn to protect his rationalist theology from a critique of Berlin Orthodox, as well as to win over Bonn University to Hegelianism. Bauer, however, created many enemies at pietist-dominated Bonn University, where he openly taught rationalism in his new position as professor of theology. Bauer attested in letters during this time that he tried to provoke a scandal to force the government either to give complete freedom of science and teaching to its university professors or to openly express its anti-Enlightenment position by removing him from his post. So Bruno Bauer died in Rixdorf in 1882. His younger brother Edgar was a German left-wing journalist who had supported his brother's fights and was sent to prison for his political position. He later became a police spy in London for the Danish government, reporting about Karl Marx, among others. In Christ and the Caesars, Bauer argued that Judaism entered Rome during the era of the Maccabees and increased in population and influence in Rome since then. He cited literature from the 1st century to strengthen his case that Jewish influence in Rome was far greater than historians had yet reported. The imperial throne was influenced by the Jewish religious genius, he said, citing Herod's relation with the Caesar family, as well as the famous relationship between Josephus and the Flavians, Vespasian and Titus, and also one of the poems of Horace. According to Bauer, Julius Caesar sought to interpret his own life as an Oriental miracle story, and Augustus Caesar completed that job by commissioning Virgil to write his Aeneid, making Caesar into the son of Venus and a relative of Trojans, thereby justifying the Roman conquest of Greece and insinuating Rome into a much older history. By contrast, said Bauer, Vespasian was far more fortunate since he had Josephus himself to link his reign with an Oriental miracle. Josephus had prophesied that Vespasian would become emperor of Rome and thus ruler of the world. That actually happened, and so the Roman conquest of Judea was justified and insinuated Rome was an even older history. According to Albert Schweitzer, Bauer's criticism of the New Testament provided the most interesting question about the historical Jesus that he had seen. So, this man has access to historical documents, and he has access to academic articles and possibly ancient information. But why would you trust him? I mean, he's a stone's throw from the Rothschild family, and his last name's Bauer, which is the Rothschild's original name. He has links with Marx and Engels. His brother was a radical political terrorist. And all of these people of this philosophical German school, and I put German in inverted commas, have all got an agenda, and that agenda was to destroy Christianity and to bring about this communist ideology, which also ties into Charles Darwin and the thought of atheism and evolution of species. I don't trust this man. We have here that it says that Bruno Bauer met with Marx again in London in the mid-1850s while visiting his exiled brother Edgar there. According to Marx' correspondence with Engels, Bauer presented with him a copy of Hegel's Science of Logic. Marx referred to this volume while completing his drafts of Capital. Bauer had already turned away from the socialism and communism of Marx and Engels, or did he just disassociate himself? So he was immune to the barbs they wrote in The Holy Family, or critique of critical criticism against Bruno Bauer and company by his pupils Marx and Engels. Nevertheless, he had fallen quite far from a favourite son of Hegel himself down to an enemy of both the right wing and the left wing as well. Suppressed and condemned by both right wing and left wing, the once influential Bruno Bauer finally settled into his family tobacco shop to earn his living. Though he continued to write, he never married, but he wrote books for the rest of his life. Now, I thought his dad worked in a porcelain factory, and I'm just wondering if that was the same tobacco shop that Edward Oppenheimer owned. It says, the father of Ernst Oppenheimer, Edward Oppenheimer, had the first shop in Friedberg selling cigars and tobacco only. The family was well-to-do, but by no means rich. So the Marxist worldview also depends on the theories of evolution and spontaneous generation. Karl Marx made it very clear that the origin of species contained the scientific basis for his views on the class struggle. However, Marx's dialectical materialism called for something more than just the gradual progress of natural selection. The dialectic needs a theory with clashes and leaps. This is satisfied with punctuated equilibrium, which says that each species stayed the same for long periods of time. Equilibrium and evolution happened through occasional ruptures or leaps, punctuations from one species to another. The origin of species emerged as Marx's pseudo-science justification for the emerging class struggle movement. In a letter to Comrade Ferdinand Lassalle on January 16, 1861, Marx wrote, "Darwin's book is very important and serves me as a basis in natural science for the class struggle in history." Marx inscribed sincere admirer in the first volume of Das Kapital he sent to Darwin in 1867. The importance of the theory of evolution for communism was critical in Das Kapital, Marx wrote. And just a question of curiosity, is Y interchangeable with U? Bayer Pharmaceuticals, Bauer-Hegel, and the Bayer merged with 5 other German companies from IG Farben. So Edgar Bauer was married to Albertine Michaelis. And for a couple of Germans who were supposedly anti-Semitic, the name Michaelis comes up with different people, and there's this man here, Lionel Michaelis, who is a German biochemist, and I'm not saying he's of any relation, but he's also a German who was of Jewish origin. Michaelis family history. Michaelis name meaning German, Dutch, and Jewish, Latinized patronymic from the personal name Michael. What does this mean? It means that Edgar Bauer more than likely married a Jewish woman, which that means he was more than likely a Jewish man. And why that is significant is because these court bankers and the wealthy of the Holy Roman Empire met in their groups and synagogues, and they made philosophical and global plans to change society. And this is just more evidence that, although small, these people were linked to these court banking families. And that's significant to all of us because it shows that the very way we think and our worldview has been plotted and molded by a minority group of people who have an agenda to control the world, to control the money, to be rich beyond imagination, and to own everything, including you and me. And they do not want a philosophy that gives people sovereignty and allows them to have a different worldview that will cause them to stand up and say no to what these people want. And, you know, today Bruno Bauer was nearly 200 years ago, and they have been working hard to change the worldview of the European people. The result that we have today is a mass population that don't think outside the box and won't stand up and say no to the dictators that tell them how to think, what to do with their children, and are so easily manipulated by a media that just is pure fiction. We have this propaganda machine that is based on all the psychological profiling that these philosophers and psychologists mapped out in the early 20th century, the late 19th century. And today the result is a dumbed down, subservient population manipulated by a Edward Bernays style media propaganda agenda. And I think this person, Bruno Bauer, was one of these family members, and he was just doing his job or his part for the family. Although it is hard to prove 100%, there's many links here that place him as a member of the Rothschild family, and I think that this is a long-term plan that they have had mapped out. And I think that there's a reason why I can't find any information on his family or their background, because it's not that far back in history, and I believe that reason is because it's deliberately been hidden. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this information.